No, it's like you're just devotees. I'm sure Chad is what brings you out.
Hardly.
Oh, come on, don't
Well,
be
the ring
modest.
never stops the breath.
Yeah, that's right. Very good. Yes, absolutely. All right. So tea. There's a lot we can say about tea, but tea takes England by storm in the 18th century, in the 1700s. Here you see a slide of Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson, right, who wrote the first dictionary. He was a tea fiend. He was known to drink 20 to 30 cups a day. So I know, I'm imagining it was maybe weak tea, but that kept him going. Before then, so before the 1700s, the British were coffee drinkers. And it's not as if coffee completely disappeared, but what people often talk about the difference between coffee and tea in England in the 1700s is that coffee tended to be drank in public in coffee houses. That was more by men. In the East End of London, coffee houses where a lot of business was transacted. Before the stock exchange was built in the early 1800s, if you wanted to buy shares in a company, you would go to coffee houses in the East End of London to buy them. So tea was more of a domestic beverage, and tea was presided over by women. Tea was seen as a more feminized kind of drinking ritual, though, obviously not entirely. Someone like Dr. Johnson swilling away all of his tea. The British East India Company had a monopoly on the tea trade. So this was a government chartered company, so they had the exclusive right to sell tea in England. The East India Company was based in India, and in fact the East India Company governed British India until 1857, when the British government took over from the company. The tea tax was a huge source of revenue for the British government. As a luxury, tea was taxed. And of course, as you probably know, tea played an important role in the American Revolution. Here's the Boston Tea Party, right? A waste of good tea, they're throwing it all into Boston Harbor. This is what a tea plant looks like. And this is pretty, right? Decorative. It's the leaves that are dried and fermented to make the tea. Tea was popular like coffee because it was a cheap stimulant. It kind of pepped you up. It also would take the edge off your appetite. Tea also became popular as a temperance beverage. Right, teetotalers. And it was tea. It's probably safer to drink tea than water at the time because you boil the water before you put it in the tea. Of course, people didn't realize at the time why that was, but of course, boiling the water killed a lot of the bacteria that were in the water. Tea was consumed by all social classes. It was a luxury, but it was a cheap luxury. It was something that almost everyone was able to afford. For poor people in England, working class people, the evening meal came to be called tea. We might think of a supper, and it might consist simply of tea, bread, and jam. For middle class and wealthy Britons, tea became an elaborate late afternoon entertainment, especially for women. Tea, all sorts of dainty dishes perhaps, delicate cakes and sandwiches might be served. Tea also became an occasion to show off one's home and possessions. You can see here all the nice china and silverware and the nice fancy tea service. Tea was an occasion, tea was a time in late afternoon when men were perhaps still at the office. This is a way that women made social calls with one another and served tea to one another. So it became an important social ritual for the middle and upper classes. Having nice china tea services. I mean, china, right, coming from China, like tea came from China. This is the classic blue and white patterns. This was kind of the pattern associated with the Ming Dynasty. But by the 1700s and the 1800s, this kind of blue and white china had become so popular that a lot of European potteries, first in the Netherlands and later in England, made china, blue and white services that were an imitation of Chinese Ming china. So, I mean, this became part of sort of middle upper class conspicuous consumption. It was a way to sort of show off your tastefulness, that you had the right kind of tea service, that you had you were able to entertain your guests, and you were able to show off the kinds of things that you were able to afford. It's interesting. This is a very early photograph, one of the earliest photographs taken in England by Fox Talbot, who was one of the inventors of photography. It's from about 1840, and it's of a tea party. So it's interesting, right? That is, as early as then, this had already come to be seen as a kind of a quintessential British event, or a British ceremony, or something that was very symbolic of Englishness, or of respectable Victorian culture. Of course, middle and upper class families, you would have had a maid who would have brought in the boiling water and brought in the tea service and brought in the dainty cakes and sandwiches and things like that. But it was the lady of the house who would serve her guests the tea, or if she was very busy greeting her guests, she would ask someone to pour the tea for her, and that was a great honor to be asked to do that, to pour. The servants would not have served the tea. It's a nice British advertisement from the early 20th century advertising tea from by this point India, and we'll all have tea. There we have the little portrait of Queen Victoria in the background, the fancy mantle. So certainly by the 20th century, tea had really become it's the quintessential symbol of what British culture was all about. In fact, so much so that, something like the tea party, the crazy tea party in Alice in Wonderland. So for a comic writer by Lewis Carroll, this idea of the tea party being such a symbol of sort of middle class, upper class culture, this was like a great sort of episode to satirize, to do his kind of his crazy version of. The question, of course, is where did all this tea come from? And in the 19th century, the early 19th century, it all came from China. All the tea that was consumed in England, it all came from China. China was really pretty much where all cultivated tea was grown and manufactured. So these are some Chinese tea workers, Chinese print from the early 1800s. The British were buying so much tea from China by the 1800s that they had a huge trade deficit with China, which was very worrying for the British economy. The problem was the British didn't have that much that the Chinese wanted in return. The Chinese had all these wonderful luxury goods like silk and like porcelain, Chinaware, and of course tea, which was a mass consumed product. The Chinese also traditionally sought to minimize contact and trade with foreigners, or foreign barbarians. Also, trade with China was defined by that empire's centuries-old tradition of isolation and autonomy. The Chinese felt that they could pretty much grow or make everything that they needed, that the rest of the world maybe came to China wanting their things, but the Chinese didn't really want what the rest of the world had. The Chinese had no experience of dealing with outsiders on terms of equality. It says that the Chinese needed very little from the outside world, and their traditional trading partners were nations nearby, like Tibet or Siam or Vietnam or Korea, nations that were clearly politically subservient to China and kind of accepted Chinese superiority or domination. The earliest European traders in China, the Portuguese and the Dutch, accepted the restrictions of the Chinese system. All European trade with China, this is again, we're in the Victorian period, the early 1800s, into the 1830s. All European trade could only go through one city. This is the city of Canton in South China. So Europeans were not allowed to go to any other city in China or to trade through any other city. So this was a way to restrict and control that trade. So it was all through the city of Canton. This trade was heavily regulated by Chinese officials, referred to as mandarins. Foreign traders, so English traders who were operating through Canton, had very little, buying tea, right? Had very little contact with these officials or even with ordinary Chinese people. They mostly dealt with Chinese merchants. Foreigners could not even live in Canton. right? So the British who were trading there, they were not even allowed to live in the city, but they had to reside on Macau, which is an island in Canton Harbor. And here you see some of the warehouses and residences of foreign traders on the island of Macau. Macau is administered by the Portuguese. And I guess you can see some of the flags. You can see the British flag, the French flag, you can see the American flag, you see the Danish flag at the far right. China had no diplomatic exchanges with European countries, no ambassadors. In fact, China had no ambassadors with any countries in Asia, because exchanging ambassadors implies equality, and that was just not a concept the Chinese had. The idea was China was the center of the world, and all these other nations were inferior to China. And so the idea was foreigners petitioned the emperor, and the emperor, out of the goodness and kindness of his heart, allowed foreigners to buy or to trade with China. So other rulers were not seen on terms of equality. So this idea, this European tradition of nations exchanging ambassadors and things like that was something completely outside the conception of the emperor or officials. Chinese officials spoke no European languages. Of course, the English didn't speak Chinese. They knew next to nothing about the developments in shipbuilding and navigation and artillery, big guns that had increased the strength of European powers. That is the Industrial Revolution that had taken place in Europe. It was just not something the Chinese knew anything about in the early 1800s. So Chinese officials were kind of psychologically incapable of dealing with foreigners on the same terms that foreigners wanted, the British wanted to come into China and have equal relations. And the Chinese interpreted British attempts to do this as insults to the emperor. Another difference is merchants in China had low social status. And so the Chinese didn't understand that in England, merchants were often very wealthy, and commercial entities like the East India Company had a lot of influence and power. So that's another way in which things were very different between these cultures. So there's not a lot of mutual understanding. So what ends up creating conflict? Okay, so the British, during the 1700s, the British expand their rule over India. The British lose America in the late 1700s, but they get this new empire in India during the late 1700s. So the British presence in India becomes a base from which they trade with China. And so it's tea, right? So the British are buying lots and lots of tea, tons and tons of tea every year from China, and about the only thing the British have to offer the Chinese is Indian cotton in return, that the Chinese want. There's very little else that the British have that the Chinese are interested in at this point. And so the deficit is such that the British buy 9 times more from the Chinese than they sell the Chinese. And of course, this is mostly tea. And this creates a horrible trade deficit. So a lot of British silver is pouring into China, and they're not getting that silver back because the Chinese are buying very little. So this begins to change in the early 1800s because the British find something that they are able to sell the Chinese, and that is opium. So the world opium production is centered in India, British India. And opium, of course, was widely used as a medicine at the time. Of course, there's still no better painkiller available. Of course, opium is also highly addictive, right? That's a unfortunate side effect. So the Chinese are buying opium from the British, and in fact, the British are pushing so much like cheap opium into the Chinese market that this leads to serious addiction in China. So, the British tea drinking leads to Chinese opium addiction. Right? So the fact that the British are drinking so much tea and buying so much tea from China, and they're not able to find anything the Chinese want in return until opium starts to flood the Chinese market. And so now the trade deficit begins to work. At least it's getting better. The British are able to make a lot of money. And you get a sense of this, right? The industrial nature of opium manufacturing in India. I mean, these vast kinds of factories and warehouses. Here's another image again. See, right? Just look at the people compared to these massive, storied with these giant. You see the big kind of balls or bales of opium being packed up for transport. So the oops, too far. So during the 1830s, opium addiction had become such a huge problem in China that the emperor tries to stamp it out. And there's a concerted effort to try to keep this opium from coming into China in such vast quantities. It was also, of course, an economic problem because now there's a lot of silver is leaving China to pay for this opium. So the Chinese, for the first time in their history, are experiencing a trade deficit. This is nothing, to pay for all of this opium. There had been attempts to ban the sale of it or keep it from coming in, but so much money could be made from it that a lot of Chinese officials were bribed to let the opium. A lot of it was smuggled in, and a lot of Chinese merchants, as well as Chinese officials, mandarins, are conniving in the smuggling of this opium. So there's a lot of corruption. So in 1838, the emperor appoints one of his most trusted officials, a man named Lin Zexu, as a special commissioner, basically a drug commissioner. Right? He's often thought of as like the first drug czar. This is an image of him from the time. In fact, there's a very nice statue of him in Chinatown in New York. If you go down to what is now Confucius Square, it used to be Chatham Square. It was named after the Earl of Chatham, William Pitt, but it's since been called Confucius Square. There's a statue there of a man in Chinese dress. I always assumed it was Confucius. It was like, oh, it's Confucius Square, it must be Confucius. And one day I went up and looked at the inscription. No, it's a statue of Lin Zexu, and there's this elaborate inscription about how he was the first, drug czar and all of this. So, Chinese Americans are very proud of him. Right. So yeah, he's trying to halt the drugs that are being peddled in China by the English, right, to help pay for their tea obsession. So that's a different kind of addiction, perhaps less destructive, at least for the British. So Lin Zexu goes down to Canton, and he confiscates all these warehouses of opium, and he burns it. So right. You can imagine the contact high from that, right? But the British are trying to, because of the increased trade with China, not just for the tea but the opium as well. The British were really pressing in the 1830s for diplomatic relations and for opening up China so that they could trade through other cities and not just for Canton. The emperor is resisting this, right? And of course, their attitude is, why should we open up to you? You're abusing us by pushing all this opium on us, and you're ignoring these restrictions and looking for ways to evade these restrictions. So, before he burns it, though, he captures all the British merchants, and he basically holds them as hostages. And he says he's not going to release them until they turn over the opium. So then they turn over the opium to him, and then to their shock, he burns it all. So this, of course, the British see this as an act of war, and this is in fact what precipitates what comes to be known as an opium war. Right? This is a war fought between England and China over England's right to sell opium in China. Right? So I know it's the kind of thing you explain to students and they can't quite understand. Wait a second. The English are fighting a war to force the Chinese to buy opium? Yes, they are. I know, right? So now, so for Lin Zexu and for the Chinese officials, they were simply enforcing Chinese law, but for the British, they're destroying English property, and this is, a violation of free trade, things like that. So the British government sends a fleet of warships to China from British India and from South Africa, right? It was also a British colony at that time. But before that happens, of course, Queen Victoria, who had just become, right? She only becomes queen in 1837. So 1838 is when Lin Zexu goes down and destroys his opium. So he writes a letter to Queen Victoria. And it's quite, he didn't know any English. He had to find some Chinese merchants who knew English to write the letter for him. He wasn't sure how to get it to England because he didn't really trust English merchants to deliver the letter. So he found, I think, some Dutch merchants who said that they would bring the letter to England. It's not clear whether this letter ever got to England. this is another point of confusion, right? So this for the Chinese, it's like, what? Your country's ruled by a woman? Like, what's wrong with you, right? So this is another, this would never happen in China, this idea that you would have a woman as your ruler. So that was already seen as a sign, another way in which the English were perverse. But the Chinese, of course, the Chinese also didn't understand that Queen Victoria was essentially a figurehead. She, the real power was exercised by her ministers and by Parliament. Again, not a concept they would have understood at all, and if you explained to them what Parliament was, they also probably would have been shocked by that, right? So Lin Zexu writes this letter to Victoria. Let me just read a little bit of it, because it gives you an interesting sort of insight into Chinese mentality from the time period. So, I mean, what he basically, I'll just summarize a little bit of it for you. So it's a very flowery kind of language, sort of formal Confucian language about, that all nations must respect one another, and that the Chinese emperor in his beneficence has allowed foreigners to come and trade in China, but these evil British merchants, that he was sure the Queen doesn't know about this, because of course if she'd known about it, she would surely put a stop to this. And he says that that if that foreigners get many things from China that they need, like tea and like rhubarb, and if they didn't understand that the English had rhubarb, but they that if they didn't stop selling opium, the Chinese would not sell tea and rhubarb to the English. And they thought this was a serious threat, because in China rhubarb was used medicinally as a cure for constipation. And it was used for all kinds of other medicinal purposes, and so they would just cut off rhubarb, and the English would all be doubled over with constipation because they wouldn't have Chinese rhubarb. I mean, that was sort of one of the underlying threats. It's unclear whether this letter ever reached England. Certainly, if it did, Queen Victoria never saw it. And the government ministers wouldn't have, I think, taken it especially seriously. But this was, an attempt on the part of Lin Zexu to try to resolve this diplomatically before things got to a more difficult pass. But so the pretext, the British use this pretext of the Chinese destruction of British property to send gunboats to China, which they do. Here's an example of one. And I think, you see this, it's not especially a big boat, but how it differs from the kind of typical sailing vessels from the time is it's steam powered, so it can sail in all kinds of weather and all kinds of direction. It's also metal clad, has an iron hull as opposed, so it's pretty impervious from attack, and they have guns mounted on it. Since it's relatively small, it can not only operate in coastal waters, but it could sail up rivers. And this was especially devastating to the Chinese because, a lot of their internal trade took place in the Yellow River, the Yangtze River. And so the British sailed these gunboats around the coast of China, and they pretty much bombard the Chinese coast with impunity. And here you see an encounter with the Chinese naval boats, these so-called junks. They're huge and very stable. I mean, these Chinese boats could sail over very long ocean voyages, and they were very, they were very well designed, but they weren't fast, they weren't ironclad, and of course, we know the Chinese invented gunpowder, so the Chinese had cannons, but the Chinese cannons were compared to the kind of guns that the Europeans had, the artillery guns that fired not only cannonballs, but fired exploding shells. The Chinese cannons were not, the cannonballs pretty much bounced off the sides of English gunboats. So this was hugely embarrassing to the Chinese and to the emperor, that the British could sort of just sail along the coast and bombard coastal settlements. The Chinese had this vast army. The British didn't need to bring a vast army to China. They could sail these gunboats along, they could sail them up the river and bombard towns and communities, completely disrupt Chinese trade, create maximum chaos with very minimum sort of investment of resources. So this goes on for a couple of years. By 1842, the Chinese had had enough, and they essentially surrender. They agree to terms, and they are forced to sign a very humiliating treaty with the English that begins what in Chinese history is often referred to as the century of humiliation. basically from the 1840s until the 1940s, when China finally liberates itself from Japanese domination. You've got one foreign group after another coming in and kind of seizing a piece of China or forcing the Chinese to sign these one-sided treaties. So as a result of the British winning this Opium War, of course the Chinese have to pay the British compensation. So they have to pay them a lot of money for the opium they destroyed. They have to allow the British to trade in several other Chinese cities, so it was no longer just going through Canton. They're forced to accept ambassadors. They have to treat the British in terms of equality. And they cede to the British, they give to the British an island in Canton Harbor, Hong Kong Island, which becomes a British possession and a British base in China and remains so for, more than 100 years afterwards. So this is all because of tea, right? This is what precipitates it all. And so the Opium War certainly gave the English much more greater access to the Chinese markets. But for a lot of English entrepreneurs, they wanted to break the Chinese tea monopoly. They wanted to be able to try to grow tea elsewhere and not be completely dependent on buying tea from the Chinese. The British had, of course, control over much of India at this time in a similar kind of climate. And tea grew wild in certain parts of India. It was not the same or as useful as the kind of cultivated tea that was grown in China. So there were a number of attempts by the British to smuggle tea plants out of China and to try to grow them in India. And they were not very successful at it. Tea is a very delicate kind of plant, and it takes a lot of experience in knowing how to cultivate it. So it was only later in the 1800s when the British were able to get Chinese tea workers to leave China and to come to India, who were experienced at how to cultivate tea, that they were able to successfully grow tea in India. So here you see some British tea planters and British officials in India with their servants having a tea party. And they're probably consuming Indian grown tea, which by the late 1800s had become a phenomenon. So here's a sort of a map of Asia at the time. So as I say, before the late 1800s, pretty much all the tea that was consumed around the world was grown in China. But by the late 1800s, the British had been able to set up tea plantations in India. These were mostly in Assam, which is over here, and in Ceylon or Sri Lanka, island off the coast. Those were where most of the tea plantations were. What was often considered the finest tea, the most delicate tea, was Darjeeling tea, and that was grown up here, the foothills of the Himalayas. Now, tea cultivation in British India was different in China. Most of the tea that was grown in China was grown on family farms by the Chinese. The British in India set up massive tea plantations. So these are owned by British merchants, by British landowners, and of course you have Chinese, first Chinese, but later Indian laborers working on these tea plantations. And ultimately they were big businesses. Of course, the most famous of these is Thomas Lipton, and he was the tea merchant par excellence from the time period. Thomas Lipton controlled all aspects of the tea trade, so he owned massive plantations in India. So in this case, he had massive plantations in Ceylon. He owned the ships that transported the tea. He owned the warehouses and factories that produced the tea, that fermented the tea and packed it. Heaven forbid in tea bags. That came much later, right? The British like to blame the Americans for tea bags, right? That vulgar American intervention. And of course, Lipton owned a lot of shops, tea shops, and distributing centers in England. And you can see that he is, by special appointment to Her Majesty the Queen, tea purveyor to the Queen. So this was another way in which merchants like Lipton's sold their products. So Lipton was also very innovative in using advertising very creatively. So another again, kind of right. Was he really using elephants to transport the tea? I doubt it, but it made a good picture, right? It was good advertising at the time. So Indian tea turns out to ends up being cheaper because it's made on this massive scale. It's now they're not having to buy it from China. Of course, people are still drinking Chinese tea, but Indian tea is giving Chinese tea a run for its money by the late 1800s. The British later set up tea plantations in Africa as well, in the highlands of Kenya, for example. So, and of course, tea drinking is something that spreads with the British Empire. It's not just something that's very popular in England. It's very popular in Ireland, in Canada, Australia, many parts of the British Empire. Other parts of the world as well are big tea drinkers. So the British can now supply their tea needs with tea that's grown on British territory. They're not completely dependent on the Chinese as they were earlier in the 1800s. Here's another tea company, a Horniman Tea Company. So you see a lot of these very nice, where tea is being kind of, you know, an Indian servant, right? It's fragrant and invigorating. A shilling sixpence, or 3 shillings 4 pence per pound. That's old money. You know, tea is something that's both exotic but also seen as quintessentially British. It's part of a sort of a British domestic ritual. And again, here is a 20th century ad: home and colonial tea, another big tea, right? Tea company. Many of these businesses, of course, keenly advertised against each other, trying to sell their product. Okay. Well, that's what I'm going to end with. And there's more tea for people to sample. I'm also happy to answer any questions people have. Any of this? Yeah.
There's a Jane Austen novel, and I forget which one it is.
Okay, I know they all blend together for me.
Where somebody is serving tea and apologizing because they have last year's tea.
Oh dear. Yeah.
Does anybody remember?
I don't know which does. I don't know which.
It was just such a fashionable thing to get like that.
Yeah. No. I think that's a great example. You know. So it's like having whatever is a fashionable tea service, and of course that changed, right? You wanted to that's what makes it fashion, right? If once everyone has it, then you have to get something different to differentiate yourself from other people. So yeah.
This advertisement, around what year would it be?
I would say the 1920s, from her dress, probably right after World War I.
Okay.
From her hemline, I would guess.
I was wondering if the showing of the ankles would have made it a sexy ad.
I think a little bit, yeah. I think it's meant to be a little bit sexy, yeah.
So they started that early.
Yeah, they're definitely using sex to sell. Yeah, even tea, for God's sake, right? Yeah. But yeah, this attractive, fashionably dressed young woman who's, obviously living a very luxurious life in British India, right? It was part of the appeal as well. But no, I think that's a good point. Yeah.
So once they were able to mass produce tea in India, did the trade with China really dwindle off?
It didn't do. I mean, they're still buying a lot of Chinese tea. Of course, it drove the price down of Chinese tea, so that was another way it wasn't good for the Chinese economy. There were debates, and there still are. Sometimes you'll go to a tea party in England, and your hostess will offer you China or India. China or India. Which do you prefer? And there are all kinds of debates among tea connoisseurs and snobs about which is the finer tea. And so some people, Chinese tea, that's just for the masses. India tea, that's the finer tea. So Chinese tea did completely disappear, but it no longer had the monopoly, and it was a lot cheaper now. Yeah, sir.
Why do the British insist that you also have milk?
Oh, don't ask me that. Yeah. do you?
I've had it forced on me.
Yeah. That's
Could you explain how afternoon tea started?
Well, I thought it became a kind of a bridge meal between lunch and between dinner, and that's mostly an a middle class or upper class custom. This idea that the main meal used to be in the middle of the day when people lived on farms and when most people were engaged in agriculture. You had your main meal in the middle of the day, and then you had that was your dinner, and then supper was just a lighter meal you had in the evening. But with the Industrial Revolution, a lot of middle-class men going off into the city to work at businesses, the idea was you had your main meal in the evening when Dad came home, and the family all had. So now dinner was in the evening, and so in the middle of the day you had a light meal, you had a luncheon, And so for the women who were staying at home, having their luncheon, in the middle of the day, tea became a kind of a bridge meal between lunch and between your main dinner in the evening. So, but that also became a way, for these women who were staying at home to entertain one another by having tea parties or by going around, making this is part of like the whole sort of social calls. You see in all the, in Jane Austen or these sort of upper class British dramas, this is one of the ways in which women were able to cement these kinds of social relationships, is that, middle upper class women, there was one day a week in which they were at home. And that was the day that their friends or people in their social circle would come and visit them and make social calls and basically be served tea. And so this was a way in which people were able to maintain kind of social relationships. And it was like, was somebody at home to you, right? That, you couldn't just go to somebody's home that you were not part of their social circle. You could make, if you were new to a town, you could make social calls in which you leave your card, with the servant, and then, the woman of the house looks at the card and decides whether or not this is a person who she is worthy for her family, for her to associate with. So as women really controlled these kinds of, so tea was just a kind of like a polite ritual, but it was a way for upper class women to kind of either expand their social circles or maintain their social circles, but also exclude people. So if someone had the temerity, or the nerve to call on you, who you felt was socially beneath you, you wouldn't return the call. Or, if a servant brought in a card, if someone was calling on you who you didn't think was really in your social circle, you would just tell the servant, I'm not at home. So not being at home was a polite fiction, right? The servant would come and say, oh, I'm sorry, madam isn't at home. That was basically a slap in the face, that, go away, don't bother us. So on the one hand, tea for the upper classes was this kind of bridge meal in between lunch and dinner, but it also played this much more important kind of social role in the way in people building these kinds of social relationships and making social calls and things like that. So which is something that was very important for people. Of course, and women are the ones who had the leisure to maintain these kinds of rituals. Yeah.
When did they transition from the loose tea to the bag?
Oh, yeah. There's some people in England who still don't like tea bags, but a lot of people do use them. I think just convenience. By the mid 20th century, tea bags have become so much more common. Another reason why some people don't like tea bags, tea aficionados, it became a way to palm off cheap tea or dust, tea dust. So, whereas if you have a loose leaf tea in a tin, you can see if it's a good quality tea, but in a tea bag, you can put a lot of pulverized cheap tea and tea leavings, mix it up. So that became another, but of course that also made it cheaper as well. Yeah.
Does tea ever go bad? I mean, can you keep it for years and years, or?
You can keep it a lot longer than you can keep coffee. I think it will eventually go bad. It will eventually go bad, but it has a pretty long shelf life, which is another reason why it was such a great trade. You could put it in a hull of a ship, and it could be could travel around the world for a month and not go bad. And same, so that was is another way in which you could have this long distance trade.
And today we have all these fancy teas.
Right.
Did they have all these fancy teas?
They started to have them. So things like Earl Grey, that's named after a popular British statesman. So yeah, a lot of these flavored teas and fancy teas were ones that were developed by tea merchants in the 19th century. Now, of course, Earl Grey had nothing to do with that. That was just a way to give it snob appeal. We're going to name this after this, this English aristocrat, so that people will want to buy it. Now, again, some tea aficionados don't like flavored teas, but a lot of people did. A lot of those did catch on.
Could you tell the story behind jasmine tea?
I don't know the story behind jasmine tea. Do you?
Yes.
So why don't you tell the story?
Behind jasmine tea, I learned in another tea party.
Okay.
They had to travel a long way to transport the tea. Sometimes it got mold, so they added jasmine to
Oh,
tea.
interesting. Interesting.
Gotten damaged.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's possible that even something as fancy as Earl Grey was a way to disguise inferior tea by adding bergamot and spices and things to it. I mean, I don't know that for sure, but that would be a possibility as well.
How do they process the tea? I mean, you saw
Yeah,
the
yeah,
plate
let's go.
before
That's good. That's a
with-
good question.
Yeah, with the Chinese guys walking through.
Yeah. So the
Yeah,
tea,
that.
yeah. So tea, so green tea is basically you harvest it when it's still young, and you have to use it right away. You have to dry it and use it right away. So most, green tea was not really consumed much outside of China. Green tea is very fashionable today, right? But at the time it was not. Certainly not in Europe. So tea is fermented. You have to ferment the tea. So you let the tea dry, you crush the tea. So basically it's like Italians crushing grapes, right? So these Chinese peasants are crushing the tea, which releases the oils, and then then it ferments, which gives it this kind of distinctive tea flavor.
What makes it ferment?
I guess the chemicals in the oil must react with the oxygen in the air. So they don't add, there's no additives. They don't add yeast or anything to it, but it's a natural fermentation process. Maybe just yeast in the air, or bacteria in the air cause it to ferment. And so at a certain point, you arrest the fermentation process by drying it, either in the sun or in trays in very low heated ovens. So that's how you get the traditional black tea. And the fermentation process is what gives it that distinctive kind of sort of bitter flavor that green tea doesn't have. So yeah, you can see just from this image that the production of tea was very labor intensive. And that also is what part of made it more expensive early on, before you had these big tea plantations. Tea had to be harvested as you had to, the tea leaves ripened at different stages, so you had to go out there and harvest them individually, and you couldn't just let them sit around. You had to prepare them right away. They would go bad if you didn't dry them right away or you didn't begin the fermentation process. So it was very labor intensive. It took a lot of people, which added to the cost as well. So originally tea was a very expensive kind of beverage in the early 1700s, but as mass production made it cheaper, and of course once you had these massive tea plantations in India, the cost went way down as well. Yes?
One of my favorites is lapsang souchong.
Yes, I like that too.
Okay, what do they do to it?
Oh, you would ask me that. Yeah, I'm not sure. It has that smoky flavor, so I'll just say they smoked it. Yeah, but I'm sure there's a very elaborate kind of way in which it's produced. I can't give you details about that. You'll have to bring in a tea merchant to tell you more about that. But yeah, that was those varieties that we still have today and that we like today. Those were mostly available in the 19th century, and so there were a lot of and the thing is, you could go to your tea merchant, especially in a city like London, but most good-sized English towns, and you could get all kinds of mixtures, or you could make your own mixtures. But a lot of local tea merchants would specialize in certain kind of mixtures of tea. So yes.
Where is tea produced today? Is it really just in China?
It's still produced in China. It's still a lot of it's produced. Sri Lanka is a huge producer of tea. A lot of tea is produced in northern India. A lot of tea is grown in the highlands of Africa. Those are the main tea grown. You have some tea grown. Not really. Not so much. I mean, I won't say positively no, but not massive production of it. There's some tea grown in Russia. Russia is one of the biggest tea consumers in the world. So the Russians are big consumers of tea. The question that's hard to answer, I'm glad none of you have answered it. I have asked it, but it's like, why are some countries tea drinkers and some countries coffee drinkers? There's a lot of explanations. Most of them really don't hold up, right? Americans used to be much bigger tea drinkers. That got displaced with coffee. Some people, it's because of the American Revolution we stopped, drinking. But that's not really true. We were drinking a lot of tea after the American Revolution. Americans still do drink a lot of tea. We just drink more coffee, but we still do consume a lot of tea. Some Scandinavian countries are bigger coffee drinkers than tea drinkers, but it's hard to know how those tastes or those patterns develop. I mean, some of them may have to do with commercial relationships, but it's not always easy to answer.
Starbucks.
What?
Starbucks.
Yeah, right, yeah. But we were big coffee drinkers before that even. So yeah.
I was to say, how important do you think that tea and drinking tea and the tea serves all that is a part of a British identity?
Oh, it still is. It's a huge part of British identity.
In England, everyone has a tea kettle. They're always this is part of it. People go there, I know it's a touristy thing, but.
It's a very but just, most English people don't have these elaborate teas, right? Afternoon teas. I mean, no one has time for that. People are working or whatever. I mean, maybe that's a little treat. But yeah, a tea break, the way we might have coffee breaks. The English drink a lot more coffee now than they traditionally did, right? And the tea merchants in England are worried about that. Starbucks and coffee companies are invading England, and tea sales have gone down in England in relationship to coffee. So a lot of the big British tea companies are worried about the invasion of coffee, which they see as kind of an Americanization. So, a lot of it came from Italy as well, right? Tea is still a huge part of British identity, and people will offer you a cup of tea as a sign of hospitality. And I think for a lot of people, especially an older generation of English people, there's no problem that cannot be solved by a cup of tea, right? Right? Let's have a cup of tea.
That's still my grandmother.
Yeah,
That's still my
no,
grandmother.
absolutely, yeah. I know a lot of people in England. That's just let's have a cup of tea. And so why not? It's
Do you know anything about the tea Russian caravan?
I don't, but I think that goes to where it's grown. I'm not sure. It may be grown in Central Asia. It's probably grown somewhere in the Russian Empire. But yeah, as to how it's produced or anything, I don't know that. But the Russians, as I said, are one of the biggest tea drinkers in the world. So I'm sure they do have their own distinctive varieties. I just don't know that much about them. The Russians tend to drink tea in glasses as opposed to China, but that's just.
Do you know anything about the Lions tea houses?
Okay, so she was asking about the Lions tea houses. This was a huge phenomenon in the early 20th century, and they're all gone now, I believe. I don't know when the last ones disappeared, but it's almost like the automats in New York City.
They were everywhere.
Yeah, they were everywhere. They were like the Lions Corner tea houses.
Yes.
And so it was a huge corporation, and it was they were. I'm trying to even think of what would even be comparable in the United States. They were they were a kind of mass-produced but very respectable institution all over London, but all over a lot of English cities. It was a way for, say, women out shopping. You'd go to the Lions Tea House, and you'd have tea and sandwiches, or you'd have tea and biscuits. They were open late. They were just. It was like a. And they were known for their very professional service, and the waitresses were called nippies, and they had this very smart kind of uniform, and it was just that's a huge kind of like forgotten part of British culture. But this the Lions Tea House, it was like
Is that the Lions family?
It was the Lions family, right, who operated them, and they were like a cheap place to go, but they weren't low class, so they were inexpensive, I should say, not cheap. They were an inexpensive place to go and get tea, but they had a reputation for being very clean and very, very, very respectable. It'd be a perfect place, to meet someone at the Lions Tea House, and just, a place, for a person. If you're out shopping and you need to stop and you need to use the bathroom or take a break, you go to a Lions Tea House, and this was just a very, you knew you would get good service, you knew it would be clean, you knew, the tea would be served nicely. So yeah, this was a huge part of kind of in the early 20th century and into the mid 20th century, a big part of kind of public tea, not having tea at home, and they just kind of, I guess, went the way of fast food.
What happened to them then? They just sort of.
Yeah, I guess they fizzled out by the 1960s. It was like not considered. Maybe it's considered too old-fashioned, not hip enough or whatever. But I think they all.
Sort of like Schrafft's?
Yeah, like Schrafft's. That would be a good example. Schrafft's in New York. Like a nice place to go, get an inexpensive meal, but a nice clean place, and yeah. Or the automats. The automats are maybe a little bit more down market, but still, those things kind of just disappeared at a certain point. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. One more question, sir? I don't know if Chad's trying to cut things off. Yeah.
What about the southern tradition of sweet tea? When you go to the deep south, sweet tea is what you get. You have to really ask for unsweet tea.
I know, and I grew up.
The thing is, north you have to pay for each cup. In the south, they don't pay or charge you for the second.
I should know that. I grew up in Texas.
I have been into backcountry restaurants which they automatically will serve you tea without you even asking. Sweet tea.
Oh yeah, you take one sip of it, you practically spit it out. It's so disgusting. Yeah, yeah. But they love their sweet tea. Yeah, yeah. I think I mean,
Give it away.
yeah, I think that I should know this since I did grow up in the South. I think the iced tea, you can understand why they have iced tea because it's so hot,
That's what
right?
iced tea is.
But yeah, but the Southerners have a big sweet tooth. They had sugar to everything. I mean, you get vegetables in the South that have sugar in them, right? So, yeah, but I'm sorry, I can't give you a very good answer about sweet tea, but yeah.
George, one thing I wanted to mention is that there's this big legend about the history of coffee, where you talked about how like the British were trying to smuggle tea plants into India and things like that. There's this big legend that apparently for a long time the Middle East was the center of coffee, and these English coffee houses and things like that. So apparently there's this, I think he was either French or Spanish guy, whoever, who steals this coffee plant from somewhere. I think it's like from a palace in France or something like that, I think, and he smuggles it to Brazil and like cultivates it, and like on the ship over in like the 18th century, all the crew is like dying of thirst because they don't have any water, but he's keeping water to keep his coffee plant alive. And then he plants it in Brazil, and that's why South America apparently has coffee or whatever. But there's no like legend like that that's with tea and.
No, kind of like there's not one as dramatic as that. They would bring plants over and they would die, and then they'd bring them over again and they would die, or they would maybe live a little bit longer and they would die. So it was more incremental. Tea grew wild up in the Himalayas, in the foothills of the Himalayas. So in British India, you could find wild tea, but it had tiny leaves and it wasn't very good. So it just took longer for them to. So I wish I should just make up a story like that. But no.
We can make one up about sweet tea.
No, right. I should have, right? Or that's about like someone smuggling a silk cocoon out of China in a hollow cane. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's another like story that gets told a lot. So, yeah.
Somebody told me once that the origin of the tea was because the emperor was just, had a fire going and I don't know, outside or something, and put the water on there to boil on this, leaf.
Yeah, that's a made-up story, but it's a good one, right? Yeah. It sounds fun. It's a good story to tell, but yeah, I'm sure that's totally made up. Yeah, but you would wonder, like, who was the first person who got that thing and boiled it in water, right? I don't know. Yeah. Right. Well, thank you so much for your questions. If there's any tea back there anymore, or.